welcome to Christ and Culture. This is Pastor Jeff Short. Glad to have you along for today's program. Today we're going to be talking about church pastors, people like Rick Warren and John MacArthur out there at Grace Community Church. And we're going to be talking about the mask mandates, and we're going to be talking about a Christian response or reflection about that. And these are issues that Christians need to grapple with because these are cultural issues that we do have scripture that touches on topics that are related to these. So we need to try to think through these issues from a biblical Christian worldview. Now, a lot of pastors, especially the large mega churches, seeker pastor churches, like Rick Warren, are basically saying we just need to follow all of the health mandates that the government gives to us. It doesn't matter how difficult they are. It doesn't matter how long they are. We just need to do whatever the government says, obey them, be good citizens, really not push back on them. I think the biggest example of this would be, for example, Andy Stanley, his church in Georgia, where he basically shut down his church for over a year, and they didn't have in-person worship. And his rationale, just like Rick Warren out there in California, out there near, it's in Saddleback Valley, which is south of Los Angeles, but in Orange County. And he basically says it's an example of love thy neighbor. We don't want to risk a super spreader event for church. And so we're just going to follow whatever the guidelines are given by our county. And out there in LA County and out there in that area, they are very strict. And they are quick to lock down. They are quick to use government power to coerce people to do whatever they want. And so I heard Rick Warren even recently on television saying, well, it's Christians are obligated to, in obedience to the to love thy neighbor command and to do unto others as you would have them do unto you, to basically follow whatever the mandates are that the county gives, even to the point where the county can shut down your church. John MacArthur, on the other hand, he's out there in California, and he is operating around Los Angeles, only he's in the northern part, up there, Panorama City. I've been to both churches. I've been to Rick Warren's Saddleback Church probably two or three times to attend his Saddleback Pastors Conference out there. This was a couple decades ago. And I've been to John MacArthur's Grace Community Church a couple decades ago when I was attending the Fuller Seminary for my Doctor of Ministry degree. And so when I'd go out there, they have the way the Doctor of Ministry program works is you go out there for 2 weeks and you have these 2-week seminars. And then you have a ton of homework and you spend the next few months processing it and writing papers. And then the next class is a 2-week seminar where you have maybe 15 or 20 books you have to read and then prepare for the class, and you get there, and then you have the seminar. And so during those 2 weeks, I had an opportunity to visit a lot of the churches out in California. That was a lot of fun. Went down to visit Rick Warren's church down in Saddleback Valley. And I had also attended his pastors' conferences, so that wasn't new. And I enjoyed hearing what he has to say about church leadership and so forth. Also attended like the Calvary Chapel in Costa Mesa, California. I attended at the time the Crystal Cathedral out there, the huge glass cathedral out there in Anaheim, and just a number of different churches out there in the area, which is full of mega churches. And one of the churches I attended was Grace Community Church, John MacArthur's church. He's got the Master's Seminary out there also training pastors. I think they get a Master of Divinity. And so, but John MacArthur took a totally different approach, and he said, wait, we are commanded by God. It says, do not forsake the fellowshipping of one with another on Sunday. Do not forsake fellowshipping with one another. Do not forsake meeting with one another together as a church. And so he took that as a mandate from the Lord that, hey, we don't stop our church services for these little trivial things. Now, he did initially, I think for a couple months, close down the in-person service, just in accordance with the so-called 60 days to flatten the curve or whatever it was back then initially. Remember that way back then? In 2020, we were told by the Surgeon General and Dr. Fauci and all of the experts at the CDC, let's crush the virus, 60 days to flatten the curve so that the hospitals are not overwhelmed and so forth. And so churches complied. I mean, that makes sense. If you can get it done in a month or 2 months and then get back to business, then no problem. Well, as we all know, it didn't get back to normal. And so the governments around the country and local governments, city governments, they kept imposing these mandates. And finally, eventually, MacArthur was like telling his people, no, we're not telling you to come here, but we're not going to stop you from coming here. They left the doors open. The church people started filtering back. And after, I think, 3 or 4 months, you had a pretty much full house over there like normal. And then that got the attention of LA County, and they wanted to shut the church down. They started fining the church every Sunday that they met, and they brought a lawsuit against the church, and it was a big, huge legal mess. And MacArthur kept on meeting week after week saying, no, the government doesn't have the power to shut us down indefinitely. It doesn't matter if there's a pandemic or a war or whatever. They don't have that power. And, there's a constitutional argument to be made, a strong one, that he's right, because we have a constitutional right to freedom of religion. And you can't have local health officials with the power to be able to tell congregations that they're suspending the Constitution indefinitely. Now, Rick Warren, down there in Saddleback Valley, his argument is, well, it's okay because the church wasn't singled out. They closed down businesses, they closed down Home Depot, they closed down secular theaters, they closed down all things in society, so they're not just picking on the church. Now, the refutation to that line of thinking is, yeah, but all of these other secular events and businesses are not written into the Constitution specifically as freedom of their endeavor. So, like religion. Religion has a special place in the Constitution. And government cannot prevent, block, or regulate one's personal religious devotion or one's public religious devotion. They can't close the churches down. That is not written into the Constitution for private businesses. It's not written into the Constitution for professional sports. It's not written in for entertainment venues. Very different. So Rick Warren is saying, well, it's okay because they're closing everything down. If they were just picking on us, I'd object, but everything's being closed down. And so we're not being singled out. Well, it doesn't matter if the church isn't being singled out. The Constitution singles out churches as given a special class status for freedom. And these other places are not. So that gives the church the freedom to determine for itself whether it will meet or not. Now, there were many churches who were not told by their local state or county officials to not meet, but they voluntarily said, well, we're just going to play it by ear. We're going to monitor the situation, and we will not meet right now, not because the government's telling us not to, but because we don't think it's safe for people in our area. Okay. But then the question on that point is, does the pastor of the church, like, for example, at Andy Stanley, does he have the authority under God to determine whether his people will have church on Sunday, will partake of the communion? Can he decide that there won't be any funerals, there won't be any weddings? Does he have the authority? Does that one individual, or even does the group of elders have the authority to go ahead and say, well, I know the Bible says don't forsake the gathering of yourselves one with another, but we are going to suspend it for a year or a year and a half or whatever? Do they have the authority? It doesn't seem that they do. So even if your pastor is telling you we're not going to meet for a year, people in the church can say, well, you don't have that authority to say that, because God has already given us authority to go ahead and meet. And especially in light of the fact that this virus was totally hyped, and there was this panic, hysteria created by the news media. And when you look at the statistics, it affected the older population proportionally a lot greater than it did the younger population. So I could see that the older people in the church might choose to stay home and not participate in that because of their high risk. But let the younger people come. Let the young couples come that have kids. Let the people use common sense. Work around this problem, but don't close the church down. That was John MacArthur's attitude. And sure enough, it worked out for him. So what has happened now, the latest news about John MacArthur and Grace Community Church, is that the LA County, who had sued Grace Community Church, are now dropping their lawsuit. And they are actually, as it's working out, they're actually going to reimburse the church $800,000 for lawyer fees. So that's not going to the church directly. It's going to the lawyers that represented John MacArthur in the church. That is the Thomas More Society, with attorneys like Jenna Ellis. And they won the case. So that's going to be some compensation for all the time and energy they put into defending John MacArthur and Grace Community Church. But the funny thing is that now the county, as not only are they going to lose the lawsuit, they're going to pay the church $800,000 to recoup the lawyer's costs. So it's an astounding and astonishing victory for John MacArthur. I'm glad to hear that he is vindicated. I'm glad to hear that they are actually going to be able to keep their church open. And they did successfully fight against all the efforts to try to close their church. And the work of God continued on at Grace Community Church. And you have to hand it to John MacArthur, because he stood strong for religious liberty. He stood strong for the priority of the church in a culture that's trying to marginalize Christianity, marginalize the church. You think about the secular leadership in our government, for example, like the Joe Biden, the Democratic leftist government in charge of the White House right now. They don't really care about if the church is weakened, crippled, or destroyed, because their vision for the future, and actually the vision for society, does not really include the church. Insofar as the church maybe supports them and wants to get out the vote for them, yeah, they like the church. But as far as the actual spiritual and moral work of the church, they would just as well that the church went away, because they're trying to do things that oppose biblical revelation. They're trying to do things that oppose the Word of God and oppose historic Christianity. For example, the abortion issue. They would just as soon the Orthodox historic Christian church would go away, because then they would have free reign to do whatever they want with abortion, fund different nations of the world, spread abortion far and wide. And for Christians, a true Christian, abortion is murder. It's killing of an unborn child. And God has said in the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not murder. And there are strict prohibitions against murdering. There isn't a prohibition against killing per se, because, of course, in self-defense, the Bible allows for that. The Bible also allows in a just war. If you're fighting a just war, we fought against the Nazis, we fought against Hitler, we fought against the Germans who were trying to take over all of the world. And that was a just war because we were fighting evil. So it's not a sin to kill someone in a just war for a just cause. But it is a sin to murder someone, and that's certainly what abortion is. The baby in the womb is an innocent victim of the mother and the doctor coordinating to try to kill that child. So this is wrong. It's evil. The politicians should be ashamed of themselves, and they would just as soon the church leave or be marginalized or pushed away so they can control it. And that's what a lot of these government, local, state, and federal government agencies were doing. They were trying to control the church, basically domesticate the church, have the church under the boot of the government. And MacArthur stood up for that, and I'm glad he did. He also stood strong as a Christian leader and saying, look, we are not going to allow anything to stop us from worshiping God, hearing his word, exercising church discipline, and doing the whole work of the church. You know, the Great Commission, go out, make disciples of all the nations. We're not going to let our government tell us to not do what God has told us to do. And we're not going to let the virus, we're not going to let a pandemic stop us from doing the work that God commanded us to do. We're going to pray to God and have him give us wisdom as to how to work around this inconvenience. But to shut down our churches and shut down our ministries and just put everything on pause for a year or so, a year and a half, and who knows what in the future is going to come down, and the government is going to say, you know, like that pandemic that we went through, oh, we're going to do something like that for climate change. We're going to lock down people. We're going to shut down businesses. We're going to have people shelter in place. We're going to demand that they do this, jump through this hoop, jump through that hoop. And it was really good to have someone like Grace Community Church and John MacArthur stand strong and say, no, that's government overreach. That's a power grab. You're being petty tyrants. You're trying to shut down Christian churches. Can you imagine the massive power that the devil would just applaud if he could get humans in government positions to shut down the Christian church, to stop the ministry of Christianity, to stop believers meeting together, to stop believers taking the Lord's communion, to stop praising God and worshiping. You know, it was a sad day in 2020 when Easter Sunday rolled around and all the churches were closed. There was no Easter crowd. Usually there's Christmas and Easter crowds. These are people who never go to church, never darken the door of a church. They've got other things to do more important, evidently, I guess. But they still affiliate themselves. They still consider themselves Christian, even though they violate Scripture by disobeying God. It says, do not forsake the fellowship of one another. Don't forget or forsake your assembly in church. That's what it says in book of Hebrews. Now, some people, they like to go in there and, oh, well, it doesn't really mean that. If you read it, it means don't skip church on a regular basis. Not being legalistic, not saying, well, you have to be there every Sunday. You can't get sick and you can't feel bad and you can't skip church because of circumstances ever. No, that's legalism. But the basic gist of the passage, any honest reading of the passage in the book of Hebrews, do not forsake the fellowshipping of yourselves one with another, as some are in the habit of doing. So even back in the early church, first century, there were those who were playing fast and loose with the Christian church. And some people say, well, the church isn't that important. Your relationship with God is most important. Well, yeah, it's most important. Your relationship with God is most important, but the church is also important. Or else why did the Apostle Paul and the apostles spend so much time talking about the church, worrying about the church, guarding the church, defending the church this, church that? Why so much attention to something that's an option if it's an option? It's not an option. It's very important. And the government here in our secular country doesn't care about you or the church. They don't care if Christians are strong and healthy. They don't care if Christians are holding each other accountable and encouraging. They don't care about the work of the church. They care about power. They care about controlling people and managing problems. And so John MacArthur stood strong, and he's a hero in that regard. Now, I don't agree with everything John MacArthur preaches and teaches. There are some differences that other pastors hold in respect to him, but he's pretty solid as far as standing strong and showing character, which is usually sorely lacking in evangelicalism. Usually this pandemic exposed a lot of the weakness in our leadership, but not John MacArthur. He stood strong, so we have to thank God for that. Now, here's something different. John MacArthur recently, in one of his sermons, revealed the fact that, as he was talking about how they won that lawsuit against LA County and that the county would be reimbursing the church for the lawyer fees of $800,000, in the course of that revelation, he also said that back in December, the church had COVID-19 come through there. And quite a few of the people, some of the people got COVID-19. And in the course of saying that, he also said that he and his wife came down with COVID-19 for a time period in late December. And that's why he was not preaching from the pulpit for 2, 3, or 4 weeks. I guess they're late December after Christmas into January, mid-January. That's kind of interesting, though, because it raises the question, and some people have raised this question, did Grace Community Church, did John MacArthur cover up a COVID-19 outbreak at the church? And did he cover up his own COVID-19 and his wife's COVID-19? We certainly did not hear him say that he had COVID-19. We certainly did not hear him say when he returned that he had just recovered from COVID-19. We certainly did not hear anyone from the church say that our pastor, John MacArthur, needs a few weeks. He's gotten a mild case of COVID-19. He's recovering. He's doing well. We didn't hear any admission that MacArthur or his wife or his family had come down with COVID-19. In fact, there was sort of a message being sent that some people picked up that he was just tired and he was just taking a break, which makes sense because after the holiday season, Christmas season, usually pastors are worn out. There's a lot of activities going on. There are special services. There weren't as many special services during the past with the pandemic, but it's totally logical and reasonable that a pastor would take a break at some point and not preach. And all pastors do that at some point. So there wasn't a big deal. But the question is, did Grace Community Church cover up the fact that John MacArthur got COVID-19 and that some of the people in the church had come down with COVID-19? Because the message from John MacArthur all this time, especially in the midst of this lawsuit brought forth by LA County trying to close his church down, is that there is no problem with COVID-19 at the church, and that he really doesn't really know anybody in the church that got COVID-19 and all this stuff. There were signals being sent by the church and by MacArthur that this is not a problem. We don't even have anything and trying to minimize everything. And I can understand why they want to minimize everything, because there would have been, the news reporters would have taken and twisted and tried to say, well, see, the pastor of this church that's trying to keep his church open, he himself got COVID-19. Well, it looks like the COVID-19 that John MacArthur did get was exactly the way he was telling his people that it would be, is that it's not the kind of monster that the news media are trying to make it out to be. It's not the kind of monster that the CDC is trying to make it out to be, and that your odds or chances of dying when you get this thing are not very big, and that you can usually get through COVID-19. Most people can get through COVID-19 unless they have all kinds of underlying conditions and everything. So his bout with it pretty much went the way he was saying it was. And so he probably said, I'm not going to make a big deal about it. Now, did he actually come right out and say, no, I never got COVID-19 during this time? No, he didn't. He didn't say he didn't have COVID-19, and he didn't say he did have COVID-19 during that time. He just didn't say anything. And I think what the issue will be going forward is, did the church simply not say anything about a few isolated situations where there was COVID-19 occurring in the church, a few individuals or families, but that it wasn't like the super spreader? I think they were afraid that if they started even giving any reports about anyone in the church getting COVID-19, then the news reporters would say church is a super spreader, and that would have probably ended their quest to maintain their openness during the pandemic, and they would have had to shut down, and they probably would have lost the lawsuit. But as it was, there's a difference between telling the world that you have a problem and not telling the world that you have a problem. So if you have COVID-19, it's not a sin to not tell everybody you have it, but it would be a sin to tell them you don't have it when you actually do have it. So it looks like John MacArthur, his staff, his church were right on that line of between not saying something and misleading people in that aspect. So we just need to believe the best and believe that the church actually didn't cross the line, and they didn't actually mislead people, and they didn't actually tell fabrications. They didn't actually engage in an active cover-up or actually lie, because that would definitely have been wrong. The Lord would not bless that. But it looks like they walked that fine line between not telling everything they know and continuing to move forward with the work of the Lord so that they wouldn't get shut down. So we need to continue to pray for Grace Community Church, John MacArthur, and all of the other pastors who are having to deal with these issues, that they would be given wisdom to know what to do, to know when to speak and when not to speak, and how much to say, and what to do and what not to do, and so on, efforts like that. So hope that's been a helpful commentary. Hope that's been thought-provoking, and we'll talk to you next time on another edition of Christ and Culture. God bless.